Okay, chapter 10 of our book covers the respiratory system. We are going to be looking at sections 1 through 5. As always, we want to know what the functions of the respiratory system are and what parts of the body make up the respiratory system. You should be able to describe the mechanism of breathing in the human body. So what brings air in and what causes air to go out of the body. You'll get a chance to try reading a spirograph in part of our lab for this week. And then we want to be able to describe the two mechanisms that control our breathing. So one will be our nervous system and the other will be under chemical control. As we are probably aware, without oxygen, our bodies are unable to use the energy extracted from food because oxygen is that vital ingredient in converting energy we consume into ATP, energy that we can use. So we're able to perform a little bit of anaerobic respiration, making energy without oxygen, but not nearly enough to keep our bodies functioning. So without oxygen and the ability to create ATP, really we would be dead within minutes. So the respiratory system here is pretty darn important. It allows us to ventilate or breathe. Lungs bring oxygen-rich air into the body and move air that's loaded with carbon dioxide waste from the body's processes out of the body. When we say inspiration, we really mean inhalation. So this brings air containing all that oxygen into the lungs. And then expiration is breathing out, where we expel the air that we brought in through the same pathway as it entered the body. What we exhale or expire, though, is what was left of the air after we took what we wanted from it. Internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissues of the cell, versus external respiration, which is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. So external respiration happens in the lungs, and internal respiration is going to happen in the other tissues of the body when we move that oxygen through the cardiovascular system into the tissues of the body. We call this the respiratory system because it's providing the cells of our body with a key ingredient needed to perform cellular respiration. And of course, also getting rid of the negative byproducts, that carbon dioxide. We can think of the respiratory system broken up into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is going to include the nasal cavities, the pharynx, and the larynx. We're already familiar with the pharynx and the larynx because we saw those already in the beginning of the digestive system. The nasal cavities lie posterior behind the nose and are divided into two sections by the nasal septum. It's a thin layer of cartilage and bone that keeps those two separate. Each of those cavities is lined by a moist mucous membrane, so one of those innate immune responses that we saw. And those mucous membranes serve to both warm and moisten the air as it enters the body through the nose. Because air is funneled directly into the lungs, it's really important to condition it quickly because breathing in air that's either too hot or too cold could cause damage to that tissue of the lung cells. The hairs inside the nose filter out large particles, and the mucus layer there traps dust particles. So another form of that innate immune response, keeping things out of the body that doesn't need to be there. The hairs also trap dust, pollen, and mold particles so they don't get into the lungs. We also find olfactory receptors in these mucous membrane layers, and these, of course, give us our sense of smell. The sinuses are just air-filled spaces in the bones of the face. So we have the mucous membrane around the outside, but these cavities are actually empty and able to take in air. And these also act as resonating chambers that affect the quality of our voice. So when we have a cold, our voices become kind of muffled because the mucous membranes in the sinuses swell and produce excess fluid. So those cavities are filling up more and muffling our speech. Once the mucous membranes have trapped all of that stuff that could potentially come in and damage our lungs, it then kind of drains out and funnels all of the trapped materials toward the pharynx, which we know is the passage that is shared between the respiratory system and the digestive system. And then those particles can either be swallowed and taken care of through the acid of the stomach, or we can get rid of them by coughing or spitting. So a lot happening there in the nasal cavities. And then the pharynx, just commonly called the throat. It's the space behind the nose and the mouth. And we've obviously already seen this because this is the same pathway that our food will take down into the digestive tract. And this is also where the tonsils are that we saw when we looked at the lymphatic system. But as part of the respiratory system, it's really just the funnel, the pathway that air is going to take as it travels towards the trachea. So after moving through the pharynx, the air will travel through the voice box, or the larynx. And this is a box-like structure made of mostly cartilage and ensures that only air is going to enter the respiratory tract and also produces the sounds of our voice. So we already saw how the larynx can be raised and the epiglottis closed off to the trachea to prevent food from entering during swallowing. But sound is generated by the vibrations of the vocal cords, the two thickened tissues at the center of the larynx. And you can create different pitches with your voice by stretching the cords thinner or thicker or tight, like stretching them more tightly, similarly to how you stretch a rubber band, causing it to make a higher or lower pitch. So all of those pieces, the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx, are considered the upper respiratory tract. So if you were diagnosed with an upper respiratory tract infection, you know that it would be in one of those three areas. And then, of course, we have the lower respiratory tract, including the trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs. The trachea, or what we commonly call the windpipe, is a tube that moves air from the outside, so from the upper respiratory tract, into the lungs, basically a funnel. And it's held open by rings of cartilage. So this is very different from what we saw happening in the esophagus, where the esophagus was closed when we're not using it and only opens when a bolus or a bite of food is present. The trachea, on the other hand, is constantly held open by these C-shaped rings of cartilage. And if it was to not be open all the time, the vacuum created by us breathing would actually cause the trachea to collapse. So that those rings of cartilage are holding that open so that we can constantly be taking air into the lungs. The fact that these are shaped like a C and leaving this gap here, not being a complete circle or ring of cartilage, is what leaves room for the esophagus to open and expand when a bolus is present. So just one kind of neat example of how pieces of our body can fit together to allow for the functioning of both of our body systems. Once air has traveled down the trachea, it's going to enter the bronchial tree. So we have two bronchi at the base, and each one, that's when I'm talking about a bronchus or a bronchi, it's this branched section. So the trachea is going to come down this way, and air will be funneled into each of our lungs through the bronchial tree. And bronchi are those tubes that extend from the trachea and move the air into there. Once they enter the lungs, the bronchi divide again into smaller branching tubules called bronchioles. So similarly to how we saw the arteries and the arterioles, the same thing is going to happen here. Bronchi are going to branch out into bronchioles. And then the bronchioles end in a structure called an alveolus. And those are, we'll look at those in a lot more detail next. That's where gas exchange actually happens. Bronchi, just like the trachea, are held open by cartilage, And bronchioles do not have cartilage. They are held open or constricted by smooth muscle contractions. And that's going to be based, whether or not they're open or closed, is going to be based on the changing metabolic needs of the body. Because remember, smooth muscle means it's under involuntary control. So our bodies are going to sense the chemical signals that's going to tell us, oh, we need more or less oxygen to that area. And then, of course, they're going to end in the lungs. We have a right lung that has 3 lobes and a left lung that has 2 lobes. And when we're thinking of the lungs, like learning what their function is as children, we think of them as balloons because we know when we breathe in, we're kind of blowing up the balloons. But we're not really blowing up the big sac of the lung. What we're blowing up are these teeny tiny alveoli. So as air is moved down the trachea and down the bronchioles, bronchi, it's going to be funneled to the alveoli, which are these teeny tiny little sacs through the bronchioles. And alveoli is where the actual exchange of gas happens between the air and the bloodstream. The individual sacs of the alveoli are held open by a substance called surfactant. So it's this thin layer that's coating the inside of the alveoli. Without that surfactant, every time we breathe, these alveoli would actually collapse. So similar to the function of the cartilage holding open the trachea, here we don't want to have to go through cartilage to be able to get the oxygen that we need and get rid of the carbon dioxide. So we're going to use that surfactant. So here's the layer of squamous epithelial cells that make up the outside layer of the alveolus. And here's the layer of squamous epithelial cells that make up the capillary that's moving blood through the lungs. And remember, this is the blood going through the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. So low oxygen blood is going to be coming to the lungs and being pumped through those capillaries. They're going to be provided with oxygen from the air, and they're going to drop off the carbon dioxide that they have picked up from the waste products from the body. And dropping off carbon dioxide, picking up oxygen, and then going to travel back out to the pulmonary vein to return to the heart. All of that gas exchange is happening at those individual alveoli, those tiny sacs in the lungs. Inspiration or inhalation moves air into the lungs, and expiration or exhalation moves air out of the lungs to prepare it to bring more back in. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and it's pulled down, which increases the volume of our lungs. And this allows us to bring in the most amount of air possible. As the volume of the lung increases, the pressure inside the alveoli, which is where we want the air to end up to perform that gas exchange function, decreases. And this creates a vacuum that pulls air into those sacs. And this is all possible because of something called Boyle's law. And Boyle's law says that if air is kept at a constant temperature, the pressure of the gas is inversely proportional to its volume. So if the volume goes up, the pressure will go down. If the volume goes down, the pressure will go up. And this works kind of similarly to how we saw molecules move through the plasma membrane on a concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. But in this case, the air is moving from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So this flow of air into the alveoli ensures that all of the space is filled up with air to allow for maximum gas exchange. An important thing to note here, though, is that the air itself is not forcing the alveoli open. The air is able to come into the lungs because the alveoli are already open. And I'm going to pick up with this again in the next video because that's how important it is.